Hey everyone, welcome back to Switch Top. Today, we're counting down the top 15 best open-world games you can play on your Nintendo Switch right now. These are games where you can explore massive worlds at your own pace and lose yourself for hundreds of hours. Let's jump right into it. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Complete Edition stands out as a rare feat. A fully realized fantasy RPG brought to a handheld system without losing the depth and weight that define it. Playing as Geralt of Rivia, you're thrown into a living world shaped by political conflict, folklore-inspired creatures, and morally nuanced choices that never feel black or white. What makes this version impressive is how it retains the dense atmosphere and rich storytelling even with the necessary graphical compromises. Towns feel alive with chatter, forests carry unease with every rustle, and every contract you take feels like a small narrative of its own. Combat mixes swordplay, magic signs, and preparation through alchemy, encouraging strategy rather than mindless action. The world isn't the widest in terms of empty spaces, but it's packed with meaningful locations that reward curiosity rather than just filling the map. Portability adds a unique edge. Being able to hunt monsters or follow a major questline while on the move changes how you engage with the world entirely. Yes, there are occasional dips in resolution or frame rate, especially during intense scenes, but they rarely break immersion. Instead, the game pushes you to slow down, explore carefully, read bestiaries, talk to characters, and uncover hidden stories that aren't forced on you. It remains one of the few deep RPGs on Switch that feels genuinely epic in scope.
Armies pass, necrophages follow. Let's go before any...
Hogwarts Legacy brings a full, open-world wizarding experience to both Nintendo Switch systems. But the difference between the two versions is immediately noticeable once you start exploring the castle grounds or flying over the countryside. On the original Switch, the game targets 30 FPS, but often fluctuates into the mid-20s during exploration or busy combat scenes, with handheld mode sometimes dipping even lower. Resolution also scales down significantly to maintain performance, hovering around 720p when docked, but dropping to 540p or below when the world becomes more demanding. Despite these technical limitations, the magic of the setting still shines through, and exploring Hogwarts, wandering the Forbidden Forest, or uncovering secrets feels surprisingly immersive for a portable system. On Switch 2, though, the same world gains more breathing room. Performance becomes far more stable, keeping closer to a consistent 30 FPS, while DLSS helps upscale visuals to sharper image quality. Environments have better texture detail, lighting appears more natural, and flying or wandering through dense areas feels smoother overall. It doesn't reach the fluidity of high-end consoles, but portability paired with stronger hardware makes the Switch 2 version a more confident and immersive way to experience the world. The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom delivers one of the most ambitious open worlds on Nintendo hardware, using creativity and physics-driven exploration to push how players interact with the world rather than just travel through it. On the original Switch, it aims for 30 frames per second and generally holds that target during calm exploration. But when physics systems kick in, such as building structures, fusing items, or fighting multiple enemies, the frame rate can dip into the low 20s. Resolution also scales dynamically, usually hovering around 900p in docked mode and closer to 720p handheld. Despite these limits, the sense of discovery remains powerful, thanks to vertical exploration, underground areas, sky islands, and the freedom to approach objectives in unconventional ways. On Switch 2, the experience becomes noticeably smoother. Visual clarity is sharper, environmental textures gain more depth, and frame rate stability improves, especially during complex sequences. Reports indicate resolutions up to around 1440p when docked, and smoother transitions across varied terrains, making traversal and experimentation feel more fluid. Even handheld mode gains more stability and sharper image quality, allowing long sessions to feel less restricted by hardware. Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition brings the vast alien world of Mira to Nintendo Switch with one of the most expansive open-world landscapes on the system. Its remastered visuals make a strong first impression, especially in docked mode, where dynamic resolution can reach up to 1080p, giving mountains, skies, and distant structures more clarity than ever before. In handheld mode, it settles around 720p, but still manages to feel sharper and more defined compared to its original release. Performance aims for a stable 30 FPS, and for most exploration it succeeds, keeping traversal and combat smooth enough to appreciate the game's sense of scale. However, heavily populated areas like New LA, or scenes packed with multiple enemies, can lead to occasional dips and brief stutters, though they rarely disrupt gameplay. The improvements to textures, lighting, and character models help reinforce the feeling of venturing through a living, alien ecosystem filled with massive creatures and terrain that invites exploration rather than guiding you along a fixed path. Piloting scales across canyons or soaring above continents gives the world a grand sense of verticality, making the open world feel more like a playground for discovery. Trails in the Sky, first chapter, arrives on Nintendo's hardware with 2 different experiences depending on the system. And the difference becomes clear once you start moving through towns or exploring the world. On the original Switch, performance stays mostly steady, though resolution and visual detail are limited compared to newer ports. Character models and environments look clean but simplified, giving it a more traditional handheld JRPG feel. On Switch 2, the upgrade is much more noticeable. The game can reach higher resolutions, making textures and scenery far sharper, especially in docked mode, where foliage, shadows, and distant structures take on more clarity. The frame rate aims for smooth 60 FPS and often achieves it, but some players report hitches during cutscenes, camera shifts, and busier areas, showing that even with stronger hardware, consistency isn't always perfect. Handheld mode on Switch 2 tends to be the most stable way to play, keeping a clear image and steadier performance that suits long sessions. The game's movement between towns, fields, and dialogue-driven sections doesn't demand heavy action, so the performance fluctuations rarely disrupt pacing. Instead, the enhanced visuals and improved draw distance make exploring the world feel more immersive without sacrificing its classic charm.
Not done yet! Not done yet!
Pokémon Scarlet and Violet marked a big shift for the series by embracing a true open-world structure, letting players explore Paldea freely without following a fixed route. But on the original Nintendo Switch, that ambition often clashed with technical limits. The game uses a dynamic resolution that usually ranges between 720p and roughly 864p when docked, while handheld mode stays closer to 720p. Performance targets 30 frames per second, yet frequent dips occur during traversal, battles, busy environments, or even simple movement across towns. Pop-in is noticeable, with Pokémon and NPCs appearing suddenly at close range, and draw distance often feels restricted, reminding players of the hardware's limitations. Still, exploration and freedom remain engaging enough to push many players through the compromises. On Switch 2, the experience changes significantly. A smoother target of 60 frames per second allows traversal and battles to feel more fluid, and improved draw distance helps the world feel less empty. Resolution becomes more stable, with clearer textures and sharper landscapes in both docked and handheld modes. While the visual style remains rooted in its original design, stronger hardware allows Paldea to feel more cohesive, especially during long sessions. Traversing open fields, gliding on your mount, or exploring new areas becomes smoother and more immersive overall. Rune Factory, Guardians of Azuma blends farming, combat, and exploration in a semi-open world that reacts differently depending on the hardware. On the original Switch, it aims for a steady 30 frames per second and generally holds it during calm exploration or routine farming tasks, but performance can dip during busier sections or cutscenes. The draw distance is limited, and distant objects often appear simplified to reduce processing load, which keeps gameplay functional but makes the world feel less detailed. Visual elements like textures and shadows are trimmed down, giving the game a softer, slightly blurry look, especially when handheld. Still, progression and exploration remain enjoyable thanks to its mix of daily routines, dungeon crawling, and village interactions. On Switch 2, the experience noticeably improves. Frame rate climbs towards 60 frames per second in many areas, making combat and traversal feel more responsive. The boost in resolution brings clearer environment details, stronger texture work, and sharper character models, especially when docked. Load times are faster, and environmental transitions feel smoother overall. However, handheld mode on Switch 2 still shows occasional pop-in and slight stutters when the world becomes crowded, though far less than on the original device. No Man's Sky pushes the limits of Nintendo hardware with its vast procedural universe, offering a different kind of open-world experience that spans planets, space stations, and endless exploration. On the original Switch, the ambition is impressive, but the hardware shows its limits. The game targets 30 frames per second, yet frame rate dips are common when flying between planets or when base building grows complex. Resolution stays modest, with docked mode rendering below true HD and handheld dropping even further, making visuals appear soft and sometimes blurry. Draw distance is limited, leading to aggressive pop-in, where terrain, foliage, and objects appear suddenly as you get close. Despite those issues, it still manages to deliver a functional version of the core gameplay loop, especially for those willing to accept compromise for portability. On Switch 2, the universe opens up more confidently. Resolution gains clarity, often approaching 1440p when docked, and handheld performance benefits from a smoother frame rate that makes scanning, exploration, and flying feel far more responsive. Improved texture quality and draw distance help planets feel more natural, while load times and interface speed receive noticeable boosts. Mario Kart World marks a new direction for the series by shifting from isolated tracks to a free roam style that blends racing with exploration, creating a dynamic open-world approach. Built exclusively for Nintendo Switch 2, it takes full advantage of the stronger hardware, delivering a smooth 60 frames per second experience that keeps drifting, boosting, and handling sharp and responsive. The game runs at high resolution when docked, giving karts, environments, and effects a crisp look that brings each area to life. Instead of simply jumping from race to race, players can explore larger maps, take alternate routes, and discover hidden challenges between events. The open road segments add variety to the pace, letting you move freely before diving into races or multiplayer battles. The consistent frame rate helps maintain the feeling of speed even when transitioning between world areas or encountering multiple players on screen. Visual clarity plays a big role. Tracks now blend naturally into the environment rather than feeling like separate stages. Handheld play remains fluid, retaining performance well enough to enjoy exploration sessions without feeling restricted. The shift in structure gives racing more context and personality, combining arcade-style speed with a world that encourages discovery.
You can also freely drive around this vast world in free roam. By going off-road, you can explore new areas and routes. So drive wherever your heart takes you.
Pokémon Legends ZA continues the evolution of the series' exploration formula, leaning into a more dynamic, open-world approach that blends real-time action with traditional mechanics. On the original Switch, it aims for 30 frames per second and generally maintains it during slower segments, like city exploration or dialogue. However, once the world becomes busier, crowded areas, weather effects, or fast camera turns, the frame rate dips noticeably into the mid-20s. Resolution remains modest, with distant objects and surfaces often appearing blurry or popping in late, reflecting hardware limitations. The world still carries atmosphere, but visual depth is held back by short draw distance and reduced shadow quality. On Switch 2, the jump is significant. The game often reaches a smooth 60 frames per second, making movement and battles feel far more responsive and enjoyable. Visual clarity improves across every zone, from environmental detail to cleaner textures and sharper outlines. Scenes that once felt heavy now flow more naturally, particularly during traversal or transitions between areas. Load times drop, and exploring new regions no longer interrupts pacing. While the Switch 2 version still has minor quirks, like occasional pop-in or brief stutters, they're far less disruptive than on the original hardware.
But they might be hostile. If you sense trouble, get to safety. There are Pokémon that live outside wild zones too. Some of them can even be found on rooftops.
Donkey Kong Bananza showcases what the new hardware can deliver when a classic series steps into a more ambitious format. The game leans toward a 3D action platforming style, with larger areas to explore, and, thanks to dynamic resolution scaling, it usually lands between sharp 1080p and higher values when docked. Handheld mode keeps visuals impressively clear, often targeting 1080p on the built-in screen, making portable play feel close to console quality. Performance aims for 60 frames per second, and during exploration or lighter combat, it holds that target well, giving jumps, rolls, and environmental interactions a smooth and responsive feel. However, when scenes become crowded, especially during boss battles, destructible set pieces, or heavy particle effects, the frame rate can dip toward 30 frames per second. These drops don't ruin the pacing, but they are noticeable and serve as a reminder of the technical strain behind the game's expanded scope. Visual improvements over previous Donkey Kong titles are clear. Textures appear sharper, animation quality is enhanced, and environments benefit from richer material detail. Occasional pop-in or jagged edges still appear under pressure, but they're less disruptive than in older entries. Cyberpunk 2077 Ultimate Edition is one of the most technically ambitious open-world games ever brought to a hybrid console, pushing Night City into portable territory with surprising results. The game offers two modes, a quality setting targeting 30 frames per second at a sharp 1080p presentation, and a performance mode that pushes frame rate higher with dynamic resolution scaling. The use of DLSS allows visuals to appear cleaner than expected, especially in docked mode, where lighting, texture work, and draw distance benefit from the stronger hardware. Walking through quieter districts or exploring interiors feels smooth and immersive, and handheld play retains enough clarity to keep the atmosphere intact. However, the limitations show when the world becomes busy. Fast driving through crowded streets, shootouts with multiple enemies, or chaotic crowds can cause frame rate dips that interrupt flow and remind players that the port is stretching the hardware. While these moments don't make the game unplayable, they do disrupt pacing and push the compromise between ambition and performance. Still, the fact that Night City functions at this level on a portable system is impressive, and for players more focused on exploring the story, experiencing side quests, or taking in the environment at their own pace, the Switch 2 version delivers a compelling alternative to larger platforms.
You have the manifest from the transport?
Of course I do. Uncle Fixer didn't give you the job deeds?
He did. I was just making sure.
Red Dead Redemption delivers a faithful adaptation of the original open-world Western, focusing on stability and portability rather than pushing technical boundaries. In docked mode, the game runs at a solid 1080p and targets 30 FPS, achieving it consistently during exploration and story sequences. Handheld play shifts to 720p, but still maintains the same frame rate, making long sessions on the go surprisingly comfortable. The world retains its atmosphere. Dusty towns, empty plains, and quiet sunsets still carry weight, but the limitations of the hardware show in other areas. Texture quality remains close to the original release, and distant terrain or objects often pop in late, especially when riding at high speed. Shadow quality and filtering are modest, and the overall presentation feels rooted in an earlier generation. Still, the performance stability helps the pacing of the game, and that consistency makes up for visual simplicity. Combat and horse riding feel responsive enough, and exploration rarely suffers from performance issues. It doesn't add modern upgrades, but it succeeds by delivering the full experience with minimal compromise.
Himself when I was just a little girl.
are, back at the house. Let's stop for a while before we head out on patrol.
You'll get no complaints from me, Miss McFarlane.
Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD 2D Remake brings the classic JRPG roots to modern hardware, with a visual style that blends pixel charm and 3D environments. And how you experience it depends heavily on the system. On the original Switch, the game is limited to 30 frames per second and a simpler presentation. It still plays smoothly, but the image can appear soft on larger screens, and the lack of performance options keeps the experience locked to a single setting. On Switch 2, the remake gains flexibility. Players can choose between a quality mode that maintains 30 frames per second while offering sharper visuals and clearer lighting, or a performance mode that targets 60 frames per second by slightly lowering visual clarity. The HD 2D style particularly benefits from the stronger hardware, with sprites and environments feeling more vibrant and pronounced, especially when played handheld. Movement, menus, and combat respond more fluidly at higher frame rates, making longer sessions feel more comfortable. Although the world design isn't fully open world, exploration across towns and fields feels smoother and more cohesive on Switch 2, especially with better draw distance and faster transitions. The remake retains its original pacing and structure, but gains modern responsiveness, giving the classic formula more room to breathe. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild opened a new chapter for open-world design on Nintendo systems by giving players true freedom in how they navigate, approach challenges, and experiment with physics-driven interactions. On the original Switch, it maintains a steady 30 frames per second with dynamic resolution that tends to hover around 900p when docked, dropping when scenes become busy or when weather and effects fill the screen. Handheld play lowers the resolution further to keep performance stable, and while the visuals soften at times, the vastness of Hyrule still feels impressive thanks to thoughtful world design. Climbing any surface, gliding across valleys, or discovering hidden locations always remains smooth enough to preserve exploration. On Switch 2, the experience evolves into something more refined. The game often reaches a steady 60 frames per second, making traversal noticeably smoother and giving movement a sense of momentum that fits its adventurous tone. Resolution rises dramatically, especially in docked mode, where clarity improves texture detail and distances, making landscapes feel more natural and layered. And that's our top 15 best open-world games on Nintendo Switch. Whether you want fantasy adventures, Pokémon exploration, or something completely different, the Switch has amazing open worlds to get lost in. Drop a comment letting me know which of these games is your favorite, or if I missed any open-world games you think deserve to be on this list. Thanks for watching.